Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Dr. Poonam Gulalia. I'm faculty with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The paper is titled Fieldwork and Field Supervision, and the name of the module which we will be discussing today is titled Supervision. Supervision is an extremely important aspect of the fieldwork program, and understanding the role of the supervisor, the need for fieldwork supervision, the kinds of supervisors, the modus of operation for the supervisor to help a student in the field of practice is extremely essential. So largely for this module, we have three major objectives which we will try and cover. One is to understand the purpose of supervision in fieldwork. Two, to understand the models of supervision and the process of supervision as well. The third large objective is to understand the kinds of supervisors who are available in the fieldwork program, as also the cultural influence which is possible on supervision. So, what is meant by fieldwork supervision? From the very term supervision, one can understand that it has been coined to imply that a supervisor is one who oversees a student in the fieldwork practicum. The oversight of a student on the fieldwork practicum setting by a more experienced practitioner who holds the responsibility to guide the student through the field placement is known as a supervisor. The process is known as supervision. So a supervisor is also a fieldwork educator, is also known as a mentor who facilitates the process of student learning. Now there are several interrelated functions and responsibilities of a fieldwork supervisor who facilitates student learning in a practice setting. We will understand what these roles and responsibilities are and how they impact student learning in the core part of the fieldwork program. So what is the purpose of supervision? What is the purpose and need for having a fieldwork supervisor? How does a supervisor facilitate student learning? What is the role played by supervisors? All these questions one will attempt to answer in this module. The purpose of supervision, if understood correctly, begins with orienting the student learner as to how social work is done, as to what the field is, as to what the social realities are, what is the social context, what is the development sector, and how can student learning take place in this given context. The supervisor plays a very prominent role in addressing individual goals of students and in enabling a student learner to develop his or her professional goals. It is also an integral part of supervision that a supervisor helps students to develop practice skills and competencies to become a professional social worker. In this sense, a supervisor enables the identity formation of a professional social worker. So the roles which a supervisor plays, the responsibilities which a supervisor has, all are made possible to facilitate student learning. As mentioned before, a supervisor is also called a fieldwork educator. So the educator is a staff member in an agency or a faculty supervisor or a part-time supervisor or a full-time supervisor. All this to facilitate the students' learning in varied field practice settings. A supervisor is also known as a field instructor in some departments or colleges of social worker, is also known as a practice teacher in some international placements, is also known as a student supervisor. But by and large, the role of practice educator or fieldwork supervisor remains more or less the same. It needs to be stated that there are several interrelated functions and responsibilities of a supervisor. Each of these functions contributes to the larger goal of protection of clients, provision of services as professionals, and mentoring student learners in the process of fieldwork. It is the responsibility of the supervisor as a facilitator and guide to ensure that the student learner, that means each of you, is provided appropriate services, competent spaces, such that you can facilitate clients and client populations in service delivery, in advocacy, in enabling them to get the rights for which they connect with the various organizations. So the focus of social work and the focus of fieldwork supervisor role is one which ensures that the student social worker learns about social work profession through fieldwork. That is the primary role of the supervisor. But at the same time, one needs to keep in mind that one needs to protect the clients and the target groups while enabling a student to learn while undergoing fieldwork. To begin with, we need to go to what is called the preparation for fieldwork supervision. So why do we need our supervisors to be prepared for playing their particular role? The importance of preparedness is such that supervisors who come from various backgrounds themselves, with varied experiences, with varied learning styles themselves, and with varied supervisory styles themselves, need to be aware of the field realities, need to be updated about the field situation, need to be updated about the field education program, and their role can be enhanced, quality supervision can be provided if there is a higher level of preparedness for those who are mentoring the students. It will facilitate student learning, it will help build relationships, it will help address power dynamics. All these are factors which a student will be confronted with, and therein lies the role of quality supervision. So how can a supervisor help you build relationships? How can a supervisor help you integrate theoretical inputs with practice? All these aspects you will learn by and by. So we come to the details of supervisory practices and the different models of supervision which are made available to you by the supervisors, because each of you will be allocated a supervisor as each of you will be allocated a fieldwork agency. So you may find variations among supervisors and you may be intrigued as to how these variations have arisen or arise. There will be a sense of comparison with your co-workers, with your co-students, as to whether your supervisor is following a traditional model of supervision, whether your supervisor is following an authoritarian model of supervision, or your supervisor is following a collaborative model of supervision. When discussing the purpose of supervision, sometimes student learners are hesitant to approach a supervisor or to take guidance from a supervisor because they feel that on a day-to-day basis, they will decide for themselves in collaboration with the agency or the field contact as to how they want to move ahead. Sometimes a supervisor comes across as a very ordinary person and nothing new is provided for the student. The student needs to wait and watch because supervisors are more than they come across. They carry with them a lot of experience. So they allow the student, they enable the student, they permit the student to take one step at a time. They don't step in if not required. They sometimes shadow the student in the fieldwork and discuss with the student during the individual conferences as to how the student's verbal or non-verbal communication came across, as to how the student came across in the field, into how the client's response came to the student and where the student needs to learn from. So everything that a student wants to learn will not happen in one go. And therefore, the role of a supervisor becomes extremely important. And therefore, it becomes also important to understand the model of supervision which the supervisor is undertaking, whether it's more authoritarian or more collaborative. And these are two diverse models of supervision which are undertaken by many supervisors. So, one needs to appreciate this role. One needs to give it time the way a student is given time to learn. One needs to wait and see how midterm evaluation processes take place, what role a supervisor plays, because there will also be space where you will be permitted to give feedback to the supervisor about how he or she has played his or her role in undertaking supervision and in playing a mentoring role to facilitate you as a student learner. The models of supervision range from traditional, authoritarian, to more collaborative ones. So these three major models need to be understood by a student so that a student is not intrigued or confused and can utilize the supervision which is provided to him or her. The different models which have been mentioned place varied emphasis on the supervisee, that is the student social worker, the client or the target groups, and or the context in which supervision takes place. In a more traditional setting, a supervisor plays the role of a traditional teacher and less of a facilitative role. He or she gives directions, expects the student to follow what is being told to him or her, expects the student to fall in line with what the agency expects of him or her, and not to question by and large. But in more of an ideal situation, we have a situation where both the parties, that is the supervisor and the student, use a collaborative process, which is why a different kind of model is used. The responsibility of the supervisor to select the model is such that it is the best fit for the professional growth of the supervisee. By which one means that we have students who come from varied backgrounds, with varied personality types, with varied learning styles, and some of whom have had more fieldwork experience, some of whom have had voluntary experience, some of whom have dropped out of previous undergrad programs but are keen on undertaking social work as a profession now. So we have a mix of students. If we have a mix of students, so we have to have supervision which suits the style of the student and which suits the need of the student, as well as the need, the context in which supervision takes place, by which one implies that the agencies which are provided, the fieldwork settings which are provided for supervision also vary. We have fieldwork settings in the rural belt, in the tribal belt, in the urban belt. We have fieldwork settings which are institutional settings, which are community settings, which are a mix of agency and community settings. We have fieldwork settings where health is the focus of intervention, others where disability is the focus of intervention, others where advocacy is the focus of intervention. Now we have a range of organizations, a range of approaches, and a range of supervisory styles. So the relationship which is built between the supervisor and the supervisee is such that it is built on trust, confidentiality, empathy, support, constructive feedback, respect, and self-care. Why self-care? Because burnout is an essential element which supervisors need to take in mind. Supervisors need to keep in mind when working with agencies who've been in the field for several years, who have connected with the ground realities, who work with people day in and day out. All these aspects need to be kept in mind for a supervisor to facilitate student learning. Supervisors also need to familiarize themselves with the fact that student learners or supervisees sometimes have advanced knowledge such that they are able to apply their skills and abilities when working with individuals, with groups, with organizations, or with communities. Some areas of application of knowledge can be translated into the supervisory process, but there are other areas of building practice skills, of building competencies, of nurturing self-awareness, of nurturing sensitivity. All these aspects are such that a supervisor's role is extremely important. So, after having discussed the models of supervision, we come to what is called the domains of supervision. Now, what is meant by the domains of supervision and how do they tend to overlap? The activities which a supervisor undertakes, the activities of supervision are undertaken in the field through three primary domains, namely administrative, educational, and supportive. Now, we have research scholars of Schaffer and William who have stated that administrative supervision is basically the implementation of administrative methods, administrative techniques that enable a student social worker to provide effective services to clients. But this is not the primary role of fieldwork. It is oriented towards agency policy, agency administration, or demands of the organization and focuses on a student's level of functioning related to the assignments or the tasks which are allocated to them by the organization. It is related to the learning plan which the student makes. The other domain of supervision is known as educational supervision, which focuses on the professional concerns and enables students to better understand the philosophy of the social work profession, enables them to become more self-aware and refine their knowledge and enables them to develop practice skills. It includes activities in which the supervisee, that is the student learner, is guided by the supervisor to learn about how to make an assessment, how to undergo an intervention process, how to identify ethical issues in the field, how to help address and resolve ethical dilemmas if they arise, and how to undertake a process of termination of services. The third large domain of supervision is known as supportive supervision, which helps decrease the stress related to fieldwork which a student might experience, the anxiety related to fieldwork and field context which a student might experience, and it provides student with a nurturing environment, with the nurturing conditions that complement and enable them to succeed in their fieldwork placement. It also encourages them to address and be able to cope with the varied challenges which arise due to the complexity of problems which a student might face, whether they are individual client-related problems, group activities, family-related problems, or community-related issues. Or sometimes there are unfavorable work environments which are draining for a student learner. So it is a supervisor's role in playing a supportive role that he or she enables student to have a conducive environment of safety and enables them also to develop a sense of professional identity in the process. As just mentioned to you that there are various kinds of supervisors. Why and how are there various kinds of supervisors? In some schools of social work which have large numbers of students in the master's program, students are divided into smaller groups and there are a varied number of agencies where students are placed for fieldwork. In such situations, we have faculty supervisors, we have a few agency supervisors, We have some full-time supervisors, and we also have possibility of part-time supervisors who are in the field primarily for the purpose of mentoring students in the fieldwork program. In some schools of social work which have smaller number of students, we have lesser number of external supervisors and more faculty supervisors who undertake this process. When supervisors are allocated to students, it becomes essential to appreciate the fact that these supervisors come from varied backgrounds, have varied learning experiences, themselves have varied experiences in the field, and bring with them the merit and strengths of their specializations and of their own strengths from which students can learn from and move forward to develop as a professional social worker. Having understood the domains of supervision, the supervisory styles, the models of supervision, and the fact that supervisors themselves are of varied forms, one needs to understand that supervision takes place either as a one-to-one situation, which is known as individual, which is wherein individual conferences are held with students on a one-to-one basis. There are spaces where group conferences are held and one supervisor is allocated to a group of students. Other than that, we have what is known as peer learning, wherein a supervisor mentors a group of students through activities and learning experiences which students may have had in different settings but under one thematic area. Other than that, there are schools which follow a practice of co-supervision where a more senior mentor facilitates a newcomer in the profession, a newcomer in the supervisory role, and co-supervision is undertaken. Cultural supervision is one aspect which has come to light more recently when we have had exchange students coming for fieldwork and for internship to field placements in the Indian context. And some of our own students also go abroad for field placement. So supervision across borders needs to be understood for us to appreciate the role played by supervisors for student learning. Now that we have understood the roles that supervisors played, the supervisory process entails a relationship between the student and the supervisor. There is a sharing of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. There is an upgradation of knowledge, skills, attitudes. And there is also a recognition that one's emotional response to the student learner needs to be taken into account. It has been mentioned a while ago that students are sometimes anxious about the field and the field realities. So it becomes the supervisor's role to enable the student through this process. Enabling the student to understand the organizational structure, dynamics, organizational behavior also becomes a mandate of the supervisory process. And the student is enabled by the supervisor who demonstrates mastery of the methods of supervision, utilizing skills of communication, utilizing different learning styles, utilizing skills in relationship building, and utilizing a problem-solving approach in the field. When one discusses the process of supervision, which is also known as the supervisory process, one important aspect is the relationship between a student and a supervisor. The relationship is valuable, needs to be understood, needs to be worked on, needs to be developed. The relationship between a student and supervisor at the outset is very different from how it develops. And the two main stakeholders in this relationship are the student and the supervisor. Once we understand that a student is an adult learner and has a different learning style from his or her own co-worker, own classmate, own peer, and the supervisor also is an individual in his or her making and would be following their own supervisory style, it is a rapport which is built between the student and the supervisor which enables the relationship to build. There are times when, with all good intentions between the two parties, the relationship does not take off. The relationship begins to be damaged or does not bear fruition or is not working for the student. It is herein that both parties need to take stock of the situation. Both parties need to approach either the faculty advisor or the fieldwork coordinator to discuss how things are working in the field, what are the factors which are impeding the relationship, what are the issues or concerns which the student has with regard to the learning opportunities which he or she is being provided in the field. Is it the organizational dynamics or other factors which are impacting the relationship? And what can be done to arrest this situation so that student learning can take place in a more congenial environment? Individual factors, individual learning styles, and individual personalities may not change entirely, but a discussion, being mindful of this and addressing the nip in the bud is good for progressive learning. The cultural influence on social work supervision, as I mentioned, is a relatively new aspect which some schools of social work and fieldwork secretariats have begun discussing, because having crossed borders and having crossed cities, we have students from varied backgrounds who come for fieldwork to organizations and to schools of social work from different states. This mobility has enabled a supervisor to look at the need for time management, to look at the physical space, to look at the organizational space, and to look at the different value orientations which students come from. All these aspects influence social work supervision in a big way and need to be taken into account if one is to do justice to the student learner. An important aspect in social work supervision, which is not much discussed or addressed, is the cultural influence on social work supervision. Now, why is the cultural influence such an important aspect of social work supervision? We have organizations, agencies, placement settings, government settings, non-government settings. These are just some of the agency placements which I have mentioned, but they all have different organizational spaces, they all have different value orientations, they all come from different learning styles, and they also follow their own different cultures. So each organization, a government organization, has its own hierarchy. A non-government organization follows lack of hierarchy. So the cultural aspects of the student also needs to be taken into account. We all come from different cultural spaces, and sometimes there is a clash between the culture of the organization, the culture of the schools of social work, the permissive culture which is available in our learning spaces, and the home environments from which the students hail. All these aspects need to be taken into account by a supervisor when enhancing and facilitating student learning. Therefore, one needs to be wary of and mindful of the cultural influence which is there and which needs to be taken into account when facilitating student learning. Therefore, the role of the social work supervisor becoming more important and more meaningful. To summarize what one has been through in this module on supervision, one would need to say that the supervisor or the educator is the student's most important teacher in terms of the fieldwork program. Supervisors, being mentors and educators, require adequate skill and preparation for fieldwork supervision. Preparation for supervision includes understanding the purpose of supervision and understanding the process of supervision, with emphasis on the learning needs of the student. If professional development has to take place, then fieldwork educators need to include information on the roles and be equipped with their own selves by undertaking supervision. I do hope that this module has been understood by you and that you will refer to the e-text which is made available to you along with the relevant references. I look forward to interacting with you and discussing with you in future on this aspect of supervision. Thank you very much.